The South's Crisis of Fear in the Election of 1860. This is from our textbook, chapter 14, pages 408 to 411. How did the South go from this list that we've talked about, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, that's a win for the South. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which takes land above the line 3630 as set by the Missouri Compromise and says now that land can be open to slavery from popular sovereignty. And the Dred Scott case decision, which says that the Missouri Compromise, the whole thing, was unconstitutional. You were not the government could not ban slavery in the territories. All three of these are big wins for the South. How did we go from these three big wins in the 1850s to secession, to the South leaving the Union? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. It has a lot to do with Southern frustration and their concern that there's an anti-slavery conspiracy in the rest of the nation. We've already talked a lot about Kansas and the struggles of Kansas becoming a state, whether it's going to be a slave state, whether it's going to be a free state, and even the violence that erupts in Kansas over that dispute. By August of 1858, Kansas, now controlled by the Free Soil people of Kansas, is admitted to the Union as a free state. So we go through the rest of 1858, through the most of 1859, until we come to October of 1859. And in October of 1859, somebody that we mentioned in our discussion on Canvas, John Brown, resurfaces again with national prominence. John Brown and 18 other men raid Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, there is a federal ammunition depot, a federal weapons warehouse, if you want to think of it that way. And Brown and his men had planned to seize those weapons and ammunition, to use them to arm nearby slaves, and then retreat to the hills and fight a guerrilla war against the planters of the South. Brown's raid is a failure, all right? Brown's raid is not successful. The nearby slaves do not revolt, and Brown himself is captured by U.S. Marines. It could have died there, but an investigation revealed that prominent Northern abolitionists, important people in the abolitionist movement, had funded Brown's raid. They had given him money for this military or terrorist action. Go ahead and add a picture to your illustration demonstrating those abolitionists funding John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. This painting is entitled The Last Moments of John Brown, and it really shows what happened. John Brown was hung. He was executed for his actions, for his attack on a federal weapons depot. But in the North, Brown is martyrized. Brown becomes a martyr for the abolitionist movement. Across the North, when he's executed, church bells are rung, cannons are fired in salute, memorial services are held, and noted poet Ralph Waldo Emerson said of Brown, he would make the gallows as glorious as the cross. The gallows is the structure where somebody is hung in an execution. So let's go back to our timeline. In the South, as a result of Brown's raid, they begin searching for any conspirators in a slave rebellion. They become paranoid of a slave rebellion. They form public watch committees to keep control of the slaves. And it's at this time, December of 1859, when he's executed, that speeches are being given in support of secession, in support of the South leaving the Union. It's also at this time, as historian James McPherson puts, that Southerners identified Brown with abolitionists, and they identified abolitionists with the Republicans, and they identified Republicans with the entire North. So, in part due to John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Southerners start to see all Northerners as radical abolitionists, which just wasn't true. In fact, John Brown was probably the most radical abolitionist. But it's the perception that there are a lot more radical abolitionists that really scares the South. Perhaps even more scary is something that started that same month, December of 1859. And that was the Republican endorsement of Hinton Helper's book, The Impending Crisis of the South. Many congressional Republicans wanted to use this book as campaign literature. Let's look at the book in more detail. Hinton Helper's book is not Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin makes an emotional and religious argument against slavery. Helper's book makes an economic argument against slavery. Helper's book called for lower-class whites to abolish slavery. Lower-class whites in the South to abolish slavery. Because, he points out, it hurts their economic prospects. Non-slaveholders are hurt by the Southern slave economy. The Southern slave economy prevented economic growth, according to Helper. And he proved these statements through statistics. He used a lot of data from the census in 1850 to prove what he was saying. Now, these beliefs are sometimes called Helperism. And as a result of these radical beliefs, Hinton Helper's book is banned throughout the South. It's even burned in some areas. And for many Southerners, especially those in positions of power, Helper's book is more dangerous than Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this dangerous piece of literature is what Republicans were saying we're going to pass out in the campaign of 1860. Why was it so scary? Well, the fear was caused by changes in slave ownership. During the 1850s, the price of slaves is rising. And as a result, the number of Southerners who own slaves falls from 30% of the Southern population to only 25%. And that may not seem like a large number, but when you look at a whole region, a 5% drop is significant. And in the Cotton Belt, where slave use was most common, it fell from 50% of whites owning slaves to only 40% of Southern whites owning slaves. The Republicans, in addition to wanting to endorse Hinton Helper's book, want to make John Sherman, a Republican from Ohio, the new Speaker of the House. Now, Sherman was one of the Republicans who supported, who had endorsed Helper's book. Sherman is a little bit more radical than some other members of the Republican Party. Southerners threatened secession if Sherman becomes Speaker of the House. And as a result, the Republicans have to go with a more conservative chairman, and they do not endorse the book because they're trying to hold the Union together. Choosing a Speaker of the House is normally a quick process, but as a result of their endorsement of Helper's book, it took the Republicans 2 months to decide on a Speaker of the House. And as a result of their endorsement of this controversial book, Southerners are convinced that the Republican Party would try to turn poor whites against the planters. After all, this is basically what Helper was suggesting in his book. This is Helperism. And it's what the Republicans had endorsed, and it's what the Southerners feel the Republicans would do. As a result also of Helper's book causing such controversy, it kind of becomes clear in hindsight that if the Republicans were to win the presidential election of 1860, it would really be unacceptable for the South. Let's talk about the election of 1860. Starting with the spring of 1860, the parties are going to choose their candidates, and the Republicans are going to meet in Chicago. And William Seward is the leader of the Republican Party. However, he's seen as too radical of a candidate to put on the ticket. So the Republican Party goes with Abraham Lincoln for 2 reasons. One, he's less radical against slavery. He's a free soiler, but he's not an abolitionist. And Lincoln is from a swing state, Illinois. And if they can run somebody from Illinois it's almost guaranteed that they'll win Illinois. In 1856, when the Republicans first ran for president, they were much more focused on just stopping the spread of slavery. By 1860, they are truly a major national party. They have a multi-plank platform. They're calling for a high protective tariff. That was popular in Pennsylvania as it would support industry. They call for free homesteads. That means farms from the government created on former federal lands. That's popular with Westerners and working people. And they call for using federal money for internal improvements, especially a transcontinental railroad. In their platform, we can see how the Republicans courted votes. They brought in a few former Whigs with those calls for internal improvements. After all, that was a major part of the American system. They also bring in a few Democrats, Northern Democrats, who have broken with their party because of the slavery issue. But the Republican strategy is based on the success that they had in 1856. The Republican strategy is going to be win all of the North. Don't worry about any of the votes in the South. If the Republicans can win all of the votes in the North, they can take the election. On the other side, the Democrats met in Charleston, South Carolina. And the leading Democrat of the day was Stephen Douglas from Illinois. He had pushed the Kansas and Nebraska Act through. Before that, he had even gotten the Compromise of 1850 signed. Douglas, however, being from the North, cannot get the two-thirds majority for nomination at the convention. Douglas wants to use popular sovereignty in the new territories, any new territories that are formed. But the Deep South, Southern delegates from the Deep South at the nominating convention walk out of the convention because they want a federal slave code protecting slaveholders' rights in territories. They are now asking for a guarantee to be able to bring their slaves into territories. This is a big difference from where they were in 1854, for where they were just happy to get squatter sovereignty or popular sovereignty. The Democrats met again in Baltimore, and again, most of the Southern delegates walk out, leaving only Northern Democrats, and the Northern Democrats nominate Stephen Douglas as the Northern Democratic candidate in 1860. The Southern Democrats met shortly thereafter and nominated their own candidate, John C. Breckinridge from Kentucky. And Breckinridge is promising what Southerners wanted: federal protection of the institution of slavery in the territories. So we have three candidates. Actually, we have four, because we also have the Constitutional Union Party, and their candidate is John Bell from Tennessee. This party is made up of a few former Whigs, a few of the Know-Nothing Party members, and they nominate John Bell. This party recognizes that there is a real divide in the nation, and we are very close to conflict. Their platform calls for seeking a compromise. So, the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln wins with an electoral vote of 180. Everybody else only got 123 combined. So Lincoln did very well in the electoral vote, all right? However, he got 54% of the popular vote in the North, and that shows that strategy that they had. They wanted to win a majority in the larger section of the country, and they did that. And as a result, Lincoln won the election. But look at that popular vote. 60% of the country did not vote for Lincoln. There was no support for Lincoln in the South. There was no support for the Republican Party and their platform in the South. With Lincoln's election, we have moved very, very close to Southern secession and conflict.